This pub is being sponsored by Stephen Williams and Barbara O'Connor, who have been coming to Science Pub, I think, for every year for the past 15 years. Stephen, can you stand up? Barbara is not here. Thank you. A couple of things before I introduce the speakers. Is there anybody here who has not been here before or who is not getting the updates from me by email? Okay, so you've been here before, you know who I am, I don't need an introduction. So next month, we don't have flyers, but I want you to know who we have coming. That's April 6th, and it'll be our last one of the season. We have a young professor from Middlebury College, Andrew Swafford, and he is an evolutionary psychologist who investigates how sensory and motor pathways originate, evolve, and create behavior across the tree of life. And the title of his talk is, "What Do You and Fungi Have in Common?" So I hope most of you can make it. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to ask the chair of the Castleton Library, where is she? Okay. Nancy Mark, to come up. She wants to do a public service announcement, she said, which is about 30 seconds.
I said 60. I just wanted to remind you, and thank you, sir, and I know I'm speaking to the choir, as Martha said, this is a very warm group, but to remind you of the importance of our libraries. We have thanks going to our friends of the Castleton Free Library who sponsor events like this and programs for children. The Castleton Free Library and all of your public libraries, Paulet, Rutland, they're all coming up for vote at town meeting day, and I ask you to support them. Libraries, as I know you know, are fortresses for the access to information and access for all to be able to access that information. So in the case of Castleton, it's Article 31. I hope you'll put a nice oval in there and check that off. But I know many of you from other towns, and I know that other libraries are asking and desperately need your support. So thank you, and thank you, Martha.
So our speakers, I want you to know, drove from the Banana Belt of Philadelphia all the way here to our Arctic Vermont. Although they do have a place to crash in Brandon, so they're not destitute up here. Bettina Hoerlin is both a scientist and a public servant. She was the health commissioner for the city of Philadelphia and also a professor at University of Pennsylvania. And she holds a PhD from State University of New York. There's a lot more to her bio, but I forgot the bio, so she'll tell you more. Gino Segre, who's sitting here, they're married, by the way, is a retired professor of physics from the University of Pennsylvania. Since he retired, he has written 5 or 6 books. And this is the latest one that I just finished this morning because I thought he might quiz me and I felt like I needed to finish it. And this one was written by both of them together. And it's about the Pope of Physics, Enrico Fermi, and the birth of the atomic age. So we have two speakers for the price of one, both of them extremely accomplished and extremely knowledgeable in their fields, and we really appreciate their coming here to speak to us. Please welcome them.
Price of one, you didn't tell me that part, Martha. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. We're actually delighted to be here, and it's so beautiful, so gorgeous. We are just stunned by it every time we come up. So we wrote a book together, as Martha has told you, and we're going to try to do a presentation together. The cable wasn't long enough, so we're sort of bifurcated here. So we'll do this little dance and hope that it works. I will say, if you have written a book together, there are also challenges you can face in the future. So, Atoms in Our Family, a personal and historical account of the birth of the nuclear age. So, why atoms in our family? Well, both of us have a unique connection to Los Alamos, which was the atomic city, right? And we will be talking about that. But before we start with that, let's go to the first slide. Familiar? Okay, this is Hiroshima. Okay. Please, if I goof and forget to do this, raise your hand if you can't hear me. Please do that. And by the way, you can't hear? Okay, maybe I'll sing to you? Okay, is that better? Okay, great. Did you hear anything I said? Okay. So here is Hiroshima, and Hiroshima was the first bomb that was ever dropped, and that was in August of 1945. It was called Little Boy, and its energy was the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. A second bomb was dropped 3 days later, and that was called Fat Man, as opposed to Little Boy. And that was dropped on Nagasaki, and that was 20,000 tons of TNT in that one. Let's just for a moment compare that to World War II, where the typical bomb was 10 tons of TNT. In other words, these bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. Next. The mushroom cloud quickly became symbolic, and symbolic of American military might. Here is a gathering, a military celebration of the end of the war, I should say, and you can see that the cake, of course, had to be in the shape of a mushroom cloud. And the woman there is not to be outdone. Her hat is in the shape of a mushroom cloud. Next, please. As bizarre as that image is, this one, I think, is also clearly a mock-up. But here you have a mushroom cloud in the background, a couple sort of watching it, sort of lazy afternoon, might as well watch a mushroom cloud, and they are drinking their Coca-Colas. So the mushroom cloud was very synonymous with Coca-Cola as a sign of America. And here's yet another symbol, next. This was my high school yearbook. I'm a graduate of Los Alamos High School, and this is not the year I graduated, but they decided to put a mushroom cloud in resplendent colors, as you can tell, on the cover of this yearbook. Los Alamos was the birthplace of the making of the bomb. Los Alamos, their effort there had ended the war. It had saved many American lives. Los Alamos was very proud of this role that it had played. So let's look back a little historically in terms of how did this bomb come to be? What was it made of? What was the process? If there was only a physicist in the crowd to explain all of that, is there? Oh, Gino. All yours.
Is this mic working? No? Then let me just take that, Bettina.
Okay.
Thanks. Hello. Good. So here we have a picture of 1938. Enrico Fermi is receiving the Physics Nobel Prize from the King of Sweden. I'm going to be a little physicky, here. Good, thanks. He's receiving the prize for having developed a technique of bombarding nuclei with beams of things called neutrons, which are produced in radioactive decay. He directed this beam to all the nuclei on the periodic table of elements, 1 to 92, from hydrogen to uranium, found out lots of interesting things, which is why he's getting the Nobel Prize, and even found hints of going beyond 92, of there being elements that could be produced with this kind of technique beyond uranium. They were called transuranics. That's the picture on the left. The picture on the right is after receiving the Nobel Prize in 1938, he did not go back to Italy, which is where he was from at this point, because Italy was then in the hands of Benito Mussolini, dictator, and all that kind of bad thing. And furthermore, had just passed some law discriminating against Jews. Fermi was not Jewish, but his wife was, therefore his children were. He thought that I really need to get us all out of the way. So this was very convenient. You go to Stockholm, pick up the Nobel Prize, and then you get on a boat to go to New York. He arranged for a professorship at Columbia. So the other picture you see on the screen is he and his wife Laura and their 2 children off the boat in New York. Now, something very important in physics happened while they were on the boat. Next slide, please. You see, this is a slide called fiction, okay? Here you see a picture of a woman here on the left, Lisa Meitner. She was, at the time, a very, very well-known nuclear physicist. She was 60 years old. This is an older picture. And the other picture is her nephew, Otto Frisch, also an nuclear physicist. They were both Jewish, and they therefore had fled Germany. He had fled already in 1933 when Hitler came in and had gone to Copenhagen. She stayed. She thought she would be okay because she was really born in Austria, but in middle of 1938, she was not going to be okay anymore, so she had fled to Sweden. Here they took a walk on Christmas Eve of 1938, and nephew, and, she was reading a letter that she had received from a collaborator in Berlin saying, look, Lisa dear, I've been doing this same experiment that Fermi used to do with uranium, and I'm finding that chemically doesn't make much sense. You're the physicist, what would it be? And she and her dad started talking about it, and they said, wait a minute. This great physicist Niels Bohr has recently come out with this theory that the nucleus might be really like a bubble, a droplet of nuclear material. And she said, if that's true, droplets can sort of split into little droplets. And maybe what happened is when this neutron hit this uranium nucleus, maybe a split. I'm off speaker? Oh, okay. When it might have split the nucleus, in which case it would release an incredible amount of energy on a nuclear scale. And she said, is this possible? They both agreed it was possible. He then, after this walk, a day or two later, he went back to Copenhagen where he had a lab. She did not have a lab yet in Sweden, and he tried to see if this is actually what happened, and yes, it was. The nucleus was split. And he gave it a name. The name he gave it was fission. Okay. Now the one real physics slide in this lecture. So, please, I had to do it, you know. My physics card would be taken away. So here it is. A neutron is hitting a uranium nucleus. A nucleus is made up of neutrons and protons, things. That's just. And when it splits into two pieces. See one going off to upward, the other downward, and it releases, turns out it releases 3 more neutrons. So what does that mean? If it releases more neutrons, and you had other uranium nuclei nearby, if you've got 3 neutrons, they might lead to 3 more fissions, and then they would lead to more and more. You could have a chain reaction. So, there you are, and we'll get rid of the slide now, okay? It led to 3 big questions. The first question was, can you have a chain reaction? If you pack enough uranium together, can they all start fissioning then? This is a big challenge, and Fermi, who in the meantime had landed in New York, and he's there in New York, and they say, by the way, you just got the Nobel Prize, that was great, but, and you thought you might have gotten transuranics, but this is what really happens with uranium. Oh my God. So he set to work seeing what he could find next. So he set to work seeing if he could get a chain reaction going. Then there's a second question. If you can get a big chain reaction, might you be able to make a bomb? Well, this would be a really big worry, really big. But the physicist who thought of the droplet model, Niels Bohr, said, no, it wouldn't work. He said, I'm going to think about this more, and he did, and he said, no, it's not ordinary uranium that undergoes fission. It's just a special kind of uranium called U-235. For those in the know, or chemists or whatever here, it's isotope. And it's less than 1% of ordinary uranium. So he says, and in fact, it's almost impossible to separate it from a regular uranium. So I don't think a bomb would be very dangerous, or you couldn't be able to make a bomb. But maybe you could. So this is the second big question. Can you separate enough U-235 to make a bomb? And then he said, and by the way, I've been thinking about more physics, and I realize if fission happens, one of those transuranic, element 94, if you could ever make it, it too could fission. So the third question is, can you really make plutonium, element 94? And if you can you make enough to make a bomb? Next slide, please. So in the meantime, Fermi is trying to create fission in the lab, but it takes a lot of means, a lot of labs, a lot of money, and there wasn't much interest, despite a certain number of physicists, particularly refugees from Hitler, saying, if there's any possibility of making a nuclear bomb, and there's a lot of good physicists left in Germany, they might be able to do it, and if Hitler has a bomb, bad things really happen. So, but, the United States wasn't that eager to invest in all that much of this kind of research, and That all changed on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. All of a sudden, the United States was in a war against Germany. It's a new ball game, as we say. In summer of 1942, something called the Manhattan Project was started, and Fermi was told, get a crew together, whatever you need, money is no object, let's see if we can get fishing. So, but don't do it here in New York, you know, it's a little too close to the Atlantic Ocean. We want you to go to Chicago in the middle of the States, go to the University of Chicago and do this experiment, run it. So he said, okay. He went to Chicago, did some tests, got his crew united, and he says, we can do the test. What we have to do is build a pile. What does he mean by a pile? Well, it's very simple. You just need 45,000 20-pound bricks of graphite, a very pure graphite. In every fourth brick, you put a 5-pound lump of uranium. You assemble these all together. You will then start getting neutrons produced. You've got to put control rods into the pile. But let's get to work and do it. They did it in a squash court under the University of Chicago football field. Football wasn't being played during the war, so it was very quiet there. And they started assembling the pile in November. December 2nd, everything was ready to go. Next slide, please. And the experiment was ready to take place. Here you see a crowd of illustrious people gathered on the balcony there to see the experiment if it works. And Fermi is looking down at the controls, and early morning they start taking those control rods out one by one, and every time you take a control rod out, the level of radioactivity increases. It increases and then it levels off. So by 3:30 in the afternoon, or by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there's only one control rod left. He gives the order to start pulling it out slowly, keep checking. And finally, at 3:45 in the afternoon, he said, it will now become critical. That is, it will start, we will have a controlled fission reaction. Controlled in the sense that if we put the rods back in, it will stop. But I want to just make sure that the level of radioactivity grows exponentially. That happened over the next 4 minutes. At the end, with some nervousness there, he said, okay, the experiment has been successful. We have a controlled nuclear reaction. So that's the end of that. There's just one little thing that I wish to add as a public interest, and the footnote is that they never bothered to tell the president of the University of Chicago what they were doing, because if they had, they would have had to say, we're going to do this experiment, a controlled nuclear reaction. We're quite confident it will work and we can control it, but if it doesn't work, we're going to destroy the whole University of Chicago and contaminate the city. But Fermi has assured us that it's going to work. So do we have permission? And the probable answer would have been no.
Would somebody pass out the science quiz now that we're giving? So this atomic furnace was an incredible success. Anticipating that it would be, because Fermi was off, by the way. Next slide. The Manhattan Project went ahead full speed. And I think of it as a three-legged stool. It was three-legged in terms of the three questions that Gino already posed to you, and you had a slide for that. It was also a three-way collaboration between government, academia, and industry. Pretty unusual, right? It was the biggest government project to date. with incredible speed, 3 new towns were built in a few months. Site X was Oak Ridge, and Oak Ridge was responsible for uranium production. By the end of the war, this non-existent city, by the way, had 80,000 people in it. At Hannaford, which was Site W, they were responsible for plutonium production. By the end of the war, there were 60,000 people in Hannaford. And in Los Alamos, where the bomb was actually put together, 600 people started out at Los Alamos. By the end of the war, it was 6,000. Next, please. The Manhattan Project was led by Leslie Groves, the gentleman on your right. He was an engineer. He had built the Pentagon. He was a can-do kind of guy. He hired Oppenheimer, who could not have been more opposite than him. But they were the odd couple that worked amazingly well. There was a historian recently was asked, could the bomb have been built without Oppenheimer? And the historian thought for a while. Richard Rhodes is, for those of you who've read him, he thought for a while and he said, well, it maybe could have been built without Oppenheimer, but it could not have been built without Leslie Groves. He really oiled the wheels for a lot of this. He also recruited Oppenheimer, who was not an obvious choice. He had not administered anything, but he was brilliant, and I think that was recognized by Groves. And Oppenheimer quickly recruited a top group of scientists. He assembled that team and miraculously kept them together throughout the war. How many of you have seen the movie? Quite a bit. Okay, you saw how he kept people together. Next slide, please. So welcome to my hometown. Los Alamos, I wasn't there yet. This is a picture that was taken in 1943. I consider Los Alamos the ultimate gated community. There was a fence all around it. Security was very, very tight. Everyone needed a pass. There was no such thing as an unexpected guest. There were no traveling salesmen. You applied to have somebody come visit you, and that background of the person was checked before they were issued a pass. Next slide, please. Los Alamos was a secret city. It was not on any map. There was no address for Los Alamos. It was just Santa Fe, Post Office Box 1663. There were many babies born in that post office box, by the way. That's what would appear on a birth certificate. A young population. Guess what else was there to do? Babies. And the people were very suspicious. They knew something was up there, but the rumors started. They began seeing pregnant women from there come in and shop and enjoy in Santa Fe, and they said, I think it's a home for unwed mothers. Not quite. One of the remarkable things, I think, is that Truman, as vice president, did not know about the existence of Los Alamos until he was sworn in as president in 1945. Can you imagine let me tell you something. There's a weapon of mass destruction that we're working on. Next, please. Los Alamos had very primitive living quarters. It was very muddy. Stoves didn't work. The toilets didn't flush. As one scientist's wife said, it was not quite Eden. It was a military base, unlike Hanford and unlike Oak Ridge. And when they came there, they were given supplies. And Laura Farron, when she came there, she was given some towels, and they were all stamped USED, used. And she thought, oh, that's kind of strange. And then somebody said to her, it stands for United States. Department of Engineering. So anyway, she felt a little bit better, engineering department, I guess, sorry. There was very much a cult of masculinity in Los Alamos, very hierarchical as a society. Theoretical physicists were on top of that hierarchy, and they got to have bathtubs, which were quite a luxury at the time. Next. Here was the first meeting of the physicists when they heard the preliminary vision of the bomb. And I think you can see there the intensity of what they were hearing, knowing full well what laid ahead of them in terms of a challenge. You also might note that the average age was very young. The average age of the scientists was 29. Future of our country, right? In the hands of average age 29-year-olds. Fermi was among the oldest, he was 41. But the intensity of that slide is really quite memorable, I think. Next, please. So who was building this bomb? Well, strangely enough, it was almost all the key people were almost all emigres. Something to remember. How unlikely. They were refugees from fascism, and they met on a very remote mesa in New Mexico. Many were Nobel Prize winners, including these two Italians. That's Enrico Fermi on the left, whose code name, they all had code names, was Henry Farmer, and Gino's uncle, Emilio Segre, was on the right. Earl Seaman was his code name, and they were both Nobel Prize winners. But I always was, one of the things, Fermi was traveling between Chicago and Los Alamos, or Santa Fe more correctly, and I always had an image of him going to the train station in Santa Fe, and here he is, Henry Farmer, saying, "I would like 2 tickets to," I don't know who was getting fooled, but somebody was. Next slide, please. Everyone had a pass. This was giving you some idea of passes, and here were 2 key people in building the bomb. One of them was Hans Bethe. Henry was his son's name. Henry was a friend of mine. Hans Bethe, who had fled Germany, and he was head of theoretical physics, key division at Los Alamos, and Edward Teller, who was known as father of the H-bomb and was kind of a little bit of the villain in the Oppenheimer movie. So one of the ironies here was America's most trusted key scientists were not American citizens. None of them had citizenship yet. And they had to register as enemy aliens because we were at war, in this case, with Germany and with Hungary. Next slide, please. All of them were told not to speak the enemy's language. They could not talk Italian, they could not talk German. What united them was a fervent desire of the scientists to beat Hitler to building the bomb. And they had also a very personal stake in this. Most of them were Jewish, secular Jews mainly, but Jewish or married to someone Jewish. So, did they succeed? Gino.
Anyway, here we are. They worked quickly. The bombs were ready, both the uranium and the plutonium bomb. And the uranium bomb, they were sure would work, but there was only enough uranium for 1 bomb after 2 years of work. And so it would take another 2 years to make another one, or maybe 1 year. But they didn't have a lot of it. They had enough plutonium on hand for 2 bombs. On the other hand, they were not sure it would work. They would really need to test it because there was a good chance it would fizzle. Thank you. So a test had to be conducted, and it was conducted. Next slide, please. It was conducted on July 16th. Next slide, please. This is the gadget. It's called, what I showed you in the previous one was the gadget, the bomb that was going to be tested. Okay, next slide, please. It was tested on July 16th, 1945, in the desert south of Mexico. It worked, quote, spectacularly well, which meant better than they had expected. There's some record of, thank you. There are records of what people said when the bomb went off. Next slide, please. Okay? No? Okay, thanks. So let me just check then where I am in my notes here. There we go. Okay. So as I said, they had to test the plutonium one, and next slide should be the test. Oh, and you have it on. Okay. It worked spectacularly well. And now the question came up, what do you do with it? In order to decide that, the Department of War had set up a couple of committees, one in Chicago and one in Los Alamos. And I know, I will. Please, next slide. Okay? There was a Chicago group, and they issued a report called the Frank Report saying, don't use this as a military weapon. It will create so much bad feeling in the world. It will impede future negotiations, etc. There was a Los Alamos group set up of 4 very distinguished physicists, and you can read what their conclusion was. Okay? The Department of War then, there was still a war going on. Remember that? They decided the bombs would be used. Okay? Next slide, please. These are what the bombs look like. On your left, you see Little Boy, the uranium bomb, and on your right, you see Fat Man. Okay? The bombs were about 10 feet long. They're about a couple of feet in diameter. The picture on the left, you see Little Boy being loaded onto the plane to the Enola Gay, which dropped it on Hiroshima. Next slide, please. As we said, it was dropped August 6, 1945. It was dropped to 31,500 feet. And it then fell for some 40 seconds. It was exploded when it was 1,685 feet above the ground. The blast, we've already told you how many people were killed. The temperature on the ground when that happened was 4,000 degrees Kelvin, or some 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know, 50, 60,000 people were killed immediately by the blast and died soon thereafter. This was the effective end of the Manhattan Project. This is what it had been designed to build. It had succeeded, and a new world was going to be opening up. The bombs were successful. Next slide, please. Next slide, my dear, there. Within a little bit more than a week after the explosion on Nagasaki, the emperor went on the air. It was the first time he had ever spoken to the public, and he announced Japan was surrendering. On September 2nd, on board the USS Missouri in the Gulf of Tokyo, the formal surrender took place. You see the Army officers on the left there standing. the various people on the boat, their legs hanging over the event, and the Japanese formal wear officially surrendering. So, next slide, please. In the aftermath of the war, what was going to happen? There were two schools of thought. One was cooperation, and the other was competition with the rest of the world. Do you seek to have treaties to end war, to have international collaboration between people? There was a lot of feeling of that in Los Alamos after the war. A group called the Association of Los Alamos Scientists gathered, and many of them would, in the years that follow, try to get disarmament agreements made. But of course, as we all know, the world was entering a difficult period. There was a competition between the United States and Russia. An Iron Curtain came down, and competition seemed to be the order of the day in the following years. Next slide, please. In particular, in a date you can see there, August 1949, Truman announced that Russia had dropped its own bomb. Now, the physicists all thought that Russia would atomic bombs eventually, but it happened a little quicker than they thought. At this point, there had been this bomb conjectured its existence, so-called hydrogen bomb. And there was a question of should there be a crash program to see if it could be built and then to build it. The military was largely in favor of going this way. And what did Truman do? He convened a committee, or various committees, next slide please, to examine the question. And the committee that was set up was a 9-person scientific committee with Oppenheimer and Fermi and other very distinguished people on it. And they said, no, there is no purpose in trying to build the hydrogen bomb because whatever you want to do in a military sense can be done with atomic bombs. We have plenty of those, and those are all you need in fighting if one should ever develop. A hydrogen bomb, which would be immensely more powerful, is only to destroy large areas, like a very, very big city. And therefore, it is only a weapon of genocide. However, the effect of Russia already having nuclear bombs was putting a lot of pressure on government and on the military. Next slide, please. And in February of 1950, Truman said we have to have a crash program to develop this weapon, this hydrogen bomb. And he furthermore put a gag order on the scientists saying, you are not to come out and publicly say that you are against a crash program to develop it. So, the crash program took place. Next slide, please. It succeeded in building the hydrogen bomb that you see. It was detonated in 1952. I will say one or two words about physics of it. It's not a fission bomb. It's not nuclear splitting. It's a fusion bomb. What you do is you get nuclei to fuse together. How do you do that? You have to have immense pressure, very high temperatures. Fusion is what happens in the core of the sun when there's an immense pressure from the outside parts of the sun, and the temperature in the center of the sun is 15 million degrees. So how do you get to do it? Well, it's very, very tricky. You need to have nuclear weapons acting to detonators to have the hydrogen-like material in the core, and you can get them to fuse. There's no limit to how big you can make it, and this first bomb was the equivalent of, I bet, I don't have it, I can have it in my notes, it's, I think, 10 million tons of TNT, so it's 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima, 1,000,000 times more powerful.
So my first statement is, dear, do you remember what you were supposed to say? Because he was supposed to say something that he didn't. So let's go back for a second and talk about what Oppenheimer said when the bomb went off at Trinity. Oh dear.
I forgot, it doesn't matter much, but what he was heard to say was a quote from the Bhagavad Gita. He was very esoteric, and the quote is, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. His friend next to him just poked him in the ribs and said, now we're all sons of bitches.
So the scientists were well aware, I think, people ask this always, about the what they had achieved in the destructive power of that. And the bomb killed 160 people in Hiroshima and 80,000 people in Nagasaki. And it was one bomb, it was just one bomb. It was a different world there. Not prepared. They had seen one plane coming. Oh, it's not going to be so bad. Can you hear me? Okay. Please put your hand up if you can't hear me. Sorry, there's one person in the back. How's that person in the back? Better? Okay. So it was a new world. Oppenheimer had the sensitivity to understand that, and he also was, however, not a pacifist. You can't call Oppenheimer a pacifist. He was saying we really need to look at the world, and we need to be able to have tactical weapons, etc. But largely because of his stance, next slide, on the H-bomb. And next slide. Let's go to here. Seems to be stuck. Where's our guy? It's not moving. Did you hit something else? Okay, thank you. Don't put your hand here. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. So largely because of Oppenheimer's stance against the H-bomb, but also in a time when McCarthyism was rampant and also anti-communism was a great fear, Oppenheimer was called in front of the Atomic Energy Commission for hearings. The man who had brilliantly led the Manhattan Project was summarily stripped of security clearance. This is a real example of politics and science. And I think was very devastated by that. Next slide, please. Shortly around that time, in fact, I moved to Los Alamos. It looks a little bit different than those early slides I showed you, right? This was the street I lived on. And in other words, we came in 1953. This was post-bomb. We came because my father was a physicist. We moved from upstate New York. It was very jolting for me to move to Los Alamos. I went to a high school which was highly competitive, all the scientists' sons and daughters. And if you did badly on a test, somebody would say, oh, the radiation really has gotten to you, right? And the other thing is that football team was called the Bombers. You have to do that, right? The first summer I was there was a party for newcomers to Los Alamos, and it was a big party, and Oppenheimer was there. And for some reason, I was standing someplace where I was introduced to Oppenheimer. My parents, when we got home that evening, they said, well, what was he like? Because he was a legend by that time in terms of having led the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. And I sort of did a typical teenage thing. I went, yeah, you know, what didn't impress me at that point. I shrugged my shoulders. I'm sure he did too about meeting me. He was interested in walking the corridors of power in Washington. I was trying to negotiate the corridors of Los Alamos High School. So why was my father there? I've mentioned he was a physicist. He also had fled Germany in 1938 because his wife, my mother, was Jewish. In Germany, he was a famous mountain climber, as well as a physicist. He had made first ascents in the Himalayas and in the Alps and in the Andes. He had the world record for having climbed the highest mountain. It was in the Himalayas in 1930. And his specialty, scientifically, was cosmic rays. These are the rays high up in the atmosphere. And he managed to combine his love of mountaineering with his love of physics by studying cosmic rays. And here, next slide, please, was at that time, and I think maybe still, the world's highest cosmic ray station. And this was in the Andes. And he was at that tent for 41 days by himself, measuring cosmic rays. Sherpas came up with supplies for him, but he was essentially by himself at an altitude, it was around 20,000 feet for 41 days. So he knew a lot about the upper atmosphere, and it was just what Los Alamos needed at the time. Amazing. So they were about to embark on a major program testing atomic bombs, nuclear bombs in the upper atmosphere, and to study their effects environmentally on humans, etc. These bombs were launched primarily by missiles, and they exploded in the stratosphere and in the thermosphere. So many of them exploded about 400 kilometers up. That's about 25 miles. And similar tests were being conducted by Russia and also the Brits. My father and his group were responsible for measuring the data, collecting the data, how this did have an effect. So after 7 years of observation and calculating this data from 1955 to 1962, he wrote a definitive report on measuring the impact, next slide please, of approximately 100 high-altitude tests, and he was asked to present these findings to congressional hearings in 1963. Not in any particular order. These tests were to provide data on weapon refinement. Could you build better, bigger, more efficient weapons? Atmospheric impact, would they cause a hole in the ozone layer? What would they do to electromagnetic pulses? Would that damage electronics, transformers, satellites? And thirdly, human impact, what was the fallout? And he gathered global fallout in this case. He gathered data in all of these things and presented them because at that time there was huge public pressure to stop these atmospheric bombs. And people were saying, you're creating global fallout, which was true. People were saying, you're disrupting communication systems, networks, which was true. And that was before we had, now we have all this stuff. There wasn't that much at that time, but now we have a lot of stuff in outer space. And so they said, we really need to stop these high altitude tests. How are we going to do it so that we have a treaty with Russia, who should also stop? And the military was saying, you can't get such a treaty. The Russians will figure a way around it. And my father provided data saying, yes, indeed, you can have such a treaty because we can verify through the data that we've collected whether or not somebody is trying to cheat in terms of high atmospheric testing. So, and my father was, I'm very proud of this quote, applauded, he was I.F. Stone, and you remember muckraking journalist, and I.F. Stone said, an independent-minded scientist who annoyed the military. That was my father. So next slide, please. His testimony and data collected and public pressure led to the first arms control treaty of the Cold War. This was signed in 1963 by Kennedy. It was a precursor to many other treaties that followed it, international treaties. It was a treaty that was signed and ratified by the United States, Russia, Britain, among others. And I will tell you, there have been many treaties since then. This is the only one that has still been left standing. It still exists. No atmospheric testing, no testing under water. You could still test underground, although they tried to put a stop to that too, but were not as successful. And because the world sometimes writes itself, 1963 was also the year that Oppenheimer was cleared, and his name was cleared, and he was honored for his leadership by John Kennedy, but it turned out to be Johnson. And he was honored with his wife looking very pleased, and Lady Bird there as well. He was vindicated. So, next slide. Where are we? Oh, we're in Vermont. Notice the slide. See anybody you know? Okay, this was a march that Vermont participated in 1982. It was the largest anti-nuclear rally in history. It was in New York, but Vermont strong there. 1982 was also the year that 88% of Vermont town meetings voted to support a bilateral nuclear freeze. That momentum has died, unfortunately. Other things have taken its place. And nuclear war is a salient issue today. Next slide. Here we have 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. We have global stockpiles, over 12,000 weapons. Gino and I think it's short of a miracle that a bomb has not been used since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is a miracle that we have survived that. The threat of nuclear war still very much hangs over us. Look at Ukraine and the threats that are happening there, North Korea, and even Israel and Iran. So our state of the world is very fragile. And I think that the Manhattan Project, as much as it stood for efficiency and getting people together, people say we need a Manhattan Project for cancer, et cetera. It had tremendous fallout in terms of the horrendous way people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. May we never have to experience such a nuclear war. May our children and grandchildren and those who follow them also not have that experience. Thank you for your attention.